informative. We have Tom Henrik with us from the Freedom of Information Commission, and he is actually the Chief Public Information Officer. So we are in excellent hands. We appreciate you so much, Tom. Stream going to be taped and kept for all of us, and so we thank you very much. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Hopefully earn maybe an Academy Award or something. I'm not sure. Again, thanks for the invitation. We do these workshops all over the state. The attempt is to try to help, not to try to beat you up. Sometimes people get a little flummoxed by freedom of information. Our goal is to put you in a situation so that you're more comfortable with it, so that whatever you do, be you a town employee, town official, board, commission member, your comfort zone is broader by the time we're done. Just so you know a little bit about me, I'm not an attorney. I always ask if that's good news or bad news. I don't know how you feel about that. The reason I share that, though, is that I'm not going to give you any binding legal opinions. These are not orders. These are not commands. We teach. We try to help. I do, pre-pandemic, do about 100 of these a year, going around the different parts of the state. The numbers have ratcheted back up a little bit since 2020. And again, it's meet people, answer their questions. As we go forward, if I say something that doesn't quite register, you say, gee, we don't necessarily do it that way. Or that doesn't quite. Ask the questions as we go along. We don't need to save them towards the end. Sometimes the questions in the middle of the conversation lead to a better conversation. So don't be bashful. Ask the questions as we go along. The idea here is to try to make it so that freedom of information becomes less of a burden. Now, how many of you are volunteer members of boards, commissions? So when you go to Anthony Jack's or someplace like that, they give you a big hug, right? They thank you for all your service. Great food. Yeah, right. A lot of times when I do these sessions, especially at night, people say, Tom, you don't get it. We're volunteers. We didn't sign up for this FOI stuff. Well, for those of you who are volunteers, those of you who are watching at home, I like saying that. I was once and still am a volunteer myself. I was on one board for 10 years. I chaired it for 5. I was a member of our Board of Selectmen for 2 years, filling out an unexpired term, and they recently hooked me back onto another board. So I get what it's like to have sort of your real life, your business life, your personal life, and then boom, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, you go to a meeting and you accept all the gratitude from your fellow citizens. And I realize that it can be a difficult job, especially if you're on a board of finance around budget time or a board of education. I get it, but FOI still comes with a package, whether we anticipated it or not, because it's the law in the state of Connecticut. It's the law that's 47 years old. It was Ella Grasso's brainchild when she ran for governor for the first time. So if you do the math, 47 years ago puts us right smack in the middle of Watergate. And you had a country that was clearly in turmoil, a country that was beside itself with angst, nearing a constitutional crisis when you think about it. And Ella Grasso was in Congress when Watergate kind of exploded all around us. She was watching all this go on, and she said, if I run for governor in Connecticut, which she was contemplating at the time, and I win, one of the first things I think we need to do is create some sort of a law so that this doesn't happen in Connecticut. What I'm seeing happen, all the secret government, things behind closed doors, people not knowing what's going on. Democracy only works if people know what's going on. There's a quote that I sometimes use, if I can find it. James Madison, way back when. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. A people who mean to be their own governor must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. Democracy only works if people know what's going on. So she's seeing all this. She knows this. And she runs for governor in 74. She wins. And one of the first things she did literally in 75 was put forward this concept of an open government law. Then she did something that was kind of interesting. She said, this is so important to our state, I will see to it that this law is approved unanimously by the legislature. Have you ever watched the legislature? Right? Can you imagine a unanimous vote on this or on anything? Well, incredibly, I'm here to tell you that I've seen a video of the vote. There wasn't a single no vote in the House or the Senate. This law passed unanimously. Shows you how important it was then, but also how important it is today. But it also gives you some insight as to why we have to have these conversations. Think of the process of getting every single legislator to vote yes. Can you imagine the back and forth? Can you imagine the negotiation, the arm twisting? Well, I like this concept, but not maybe for this situation. So you've got a law that's based on a really simple, easy concept: transparency, open government. But when you try to read it, I know a couple of you in this room have tried to read it, your eyes roll immediately to the back of your head. The wherefores, the whereases, and the what do I, and so you think you've got it, but then the law seems to tell you something else. And the point there is that they wrote a law that's based on that easy, simple concept. But when you dig down and what do we do under certain situations, sometimes, at crunch time, if you will, you've got to make the call. You've got to interpret it. It leaves it open for a board to say, gee, we could go into executive session. Do we have the right to go into executive session? Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. And you got to make the call. Do we give this record out? Do we not give this record out? Because it leaves so much open to interpretation. That's why we have to have these conversations, to give you the tools to work with so that you can make the right call. Because what this law did was created the FOI Commission, which is where I work. And if people believe they've been denied the access that this law gives them, they can file a complaint against a public agency like yours with the FOI Commission. And, even if you're right, it's time consuming and you have to defend yourself. And what we'd like to do is put you in a situation so that you're never the target of a complaint, so that you do the right thing and you made the right calls and you move forward, not worrying so much about something like freedom of information, but worrying more about the jobs you were appointed, elected, hired to do. The law is about two basic things. It's about access to public meetings and access to public records. And I'll go through both of them in some detail. Emphasis on meetings for those of you who are volunteers. But one of the first things I tell people is, remember that it's not necessarily, it's called freedom of information because that sounds better than freedom of access. But it's not really about free information. And a lot of people think that it is. I suspect, Kathy and others have had situations where people march into your office and say, under freedom of information, I have a right to know. Tell me, why did you arrive at that situation? How come you reached that budget figure? Police department, I saw a cruiser in my neighborhood last night. Why was it there? Freedom of information, I have a right to know. Well, one of the first lessons is that FOI is not a law that requires us to answer questions. We do, because we're public servants. We want to help people. That's why we're doing what we do. But remember that nothing requires a public agency to answer questions. So if you're in a situation where you're answering questions, say, you know what? Why don't you go to the meeting where they talk about that? Or why don't you get a copy of the record where the budget figure is broken down? Because I'm not comfortable answering for you. You're not violating any laws. Access to meetings, access to records. And if that's ever happened to you, think for a second about working at the Freedom of Information Commission. People think we're the information center for the entire state of Connecticut. They call up and ask all kinds of questions. I spend most of my day at the commission answering questions on the phone or answering emails. Can you give me directions to the Capitol? One of my favorites is the people who call up and ask me how to get tickets to the UConn basketball game. True story. A couple months ago, I wrote down a couple in a 1 week period. An attorney from West Haven who called up and said, I want you to send me the body cam footage from my client's motor vehicle accident in Bridgeport. They think that we sit in this giant vault surrounded by every record held by every agency in the state of Connecticut. You call us, we send you the records. You don't know how many times I've written or told people, not a repository for records. You got to go to the agency that has them. You might, if you're in a situation, get request records that you don't have. You have to let people know that you got to be a little more focused. You got to do a little bit of the work. You've got to know where the records are kept. So just in general, that's something to file away. People use freedom of information to try to get information, and that's great. We want people to be informed, but the burden isn't all on the public agency. Access to meetings and access to records. When we talk about meetings, I don't read a lot of definitions, but just listen to the words of this definition. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. If you are on a board, or if you are an employee who helps a board or who staffs a board, bottom line there is to remember that anytime you gather to do your work, consider it a meeting. Get questions like this. Tom, we have something really sensitive we need to talk about. Can we meet before the meeting and not worry about notice or anything like that? The answer is no. Maybe we do that at the bank or the private sector, but in the public sector, you can't do that. Well, how about this? We're going to form a subcommittee. Now, your definition talks about making sure you have a quorum to have a meeting, but a subcommittee isn't necessarily going to be a quorum of the board, so the subcommittee doesn't have to worry about freedom of information. And whenever I hear those words, doesn't have to worry about, I get very nervous, because that means people are trying to skirt around it and they're opening themselves up more likely than not for some sort of a complaint. If you form a subcommittee, a 10-member board forms a 4-member subcommittee, that becomes a new public agency in the eyes of the law, the way the law is written. Definition of public agency, it's long, I won't read it to you, but it has a phrase that says, including any committee of or created by. So if you create a subcommittee, it's got to follow the same rules. And what are those rules? The meeting needs to be noticed at least 24 hours in advance. It needs to be open to the public. And there need to be minutes of that meeting when the meeting is done. The law gives us 3 different kinds of meetings to work with: a regular meeting, a special meeting, and an emergency meeting. A regular meeting is where the majority of meetings take place. Per a schedule you submit it to the town clerk by the end of January of every year. It says we meet on the 1st and 3rd Tuesday, 2nd and 4th Wednesday, 7 o'clock town hall, 8 o'clock library, 6 o'clock board offices. Whatever that is, that becomes your regular meeting slot. Special meeting is a meeting that you have when you're not scheduled to meet. A lot of people see that word special and they get kind of, ooh, what are we supposed to do? Special and regular are almost identical. Here's the difference. For both of them, you have to prepare an agenda. Anybody here responsible for agenda preparation? When you do that, folks, remember that the FOI Commission and the courts have been particularly paid particular attention to specificity. Cases that go to court, they say the point of the agenda is to keep the public fairly apprised as to what's going to happen. So you want to try to avoid some of those nebulous items on your agenda. You put them together. For instance, an item like other business or old business or new business, not a great agenda item, but for a regular meeting, it works because the chairman can say, is there any other business? And someone can say, yes, Madam Chairman, I'd like to add this to the agenda. It's not on there. Someone makes a motion, second, and if 2/3 of you agree, you can vote to add it to the agenda. But at a special meeting, you can't add anything. That's the fundamental difference between the two. So at a special meeting, if you're creating an agenda that you've got other business on there with nothing articulated underneath, you might as well take it off because you can't say, is there any business? Other than that, you can do anything you want to do at a regular meeting or a special meeting. A special meeting, just make sure that your agenda is as specific as possible. I had a conversation this morning with I think it's a school board up in the northwest corner, and they've got a special meeting tonight, and the item on the agenda says that the board is going to receive information about new hires. And she called up and said, we forgot to put on there, receive information and vote on new hires. My recommendation was that they not vote on it because it's not on the agenda. It's not specified that that's what they're going to do. Is that being picky? Yes, but all they would need is somebody to say, hey, wait a minute, that wasn't on the agenda, and file a complaint and maybe throw those new hires into question. So I suggested that they wait and do it at a meeting that had that on the agenda, properly noticed. The 2 types of meetings, you can do what you need to do, pretty standard stuff, but when we talk about the 3rd kind of meeting, the emergency meeting, that's one that I always get sort of nervous about for boards. I strongly recommend that you try to avoid the emergency meeting, is the bottom line. Emergency meeting is not noticed. And the legislature set the bar really high when they wrote the law because they don't want us to meet without notice. The problem is that what you and I think might be an emergency might not rise to the level in the eyes of the law. And one of my best anecdotes comes when we talk about some of the holidays we have in Connecticut: Martin Luther King's birthday, Columbus Day, Veterans Day. Inevitably, after one of those holidays, I'll get a call the next morning, goes something like this: Tom, I've got a problem. What's the problem? Our regular meeting is tonight, the day after one of those holidays. And I always make sure the agenda is available at least 24 hours in advance. And if I didn't mention that, that's when the agenda has to be in, at least 24 hours in advance. But I forgot town hall was closed yesterday, so I couldn't get it in. I brought it in this morning. That's okay, right? No, it's not. It's not 24 hours. So they said, well, we've got way too much to do. And again, those of you who are on boards and commissions, think about being prepared for a meeting and finding out that you'd have to cancel it because the agenda wasn't in on time. It's an emergency. We have too much to do. We've got to get going. Oops, I forgot. It's not an emergency. In our minds, especially those of us not legally trained, it may feel like one, but it's not. The advice there is always to wait 24 hours. People say, well, gee, what's an emergency? It's not all that well defined in the law, but it's keeping people safe, keeping people out of harm's way would be the best way to look at it. Other than that, I would avoid that emergency meeting. But if you ever have a situation like that, I did a workshop last night for a group of fire commissioners down in Trumbull. They might have that kind of a situation where they had to act really quickly to do something without 24 hours notice. You meet, you talk about only the emergency topic, and within 72 hours create minutes that reflect what the emergency was, who was there, and what you did about it. A lot of times people say, gee, well, what's the big deal? So I'll in the interest of time, I'll shorten the story. But we had a situation over on the western side of the state a couple years ago where a Board of Selectmen felt compelled to have an emergency meeting to discuss whether or not to terminate a fire marshal. A fire marshal who thought he was about to become the next fire chief. So they met and they went back and forth, and there had been a lot of tension, and there had been some screaming and yelling with the first selectman. So they said, you know what? He's no good. Let's fire him. So at this emergency meeting on a Saturday morning, they terminated him. When he found out about it, he says, what was the emergency? I mean, he didn't think he should have been fired, but he said, well, what was the emergency? So he files a complaint against the board with the FOI commission. So the commission looks at the facts, and when you have to go to a hearing, and you never have to, you tell your side of the story, the other side tells its side of the story. Well, when the hearing officer looked at the facts and said, this was clearly an attempt in my mind to keep this guy from going to the meeting. So they found against the town and invoked one of the strongest powers the commission has, which is to declare null and void everything that happened at that meeting. So now the guy was fired at a meeting that didn't happen, in essence. Now, if you don't like a decision that the FOI commission makes, you can appeal it. You can appeal it all the way to the state Supreme Court. And this town was positive that it had the right to have this emergency meeting. So it appeals it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately says, you know what, we agree with the FOI commission. We also declare null and void what happened at that meeting. Now, if you're at all familiar with the timeline, you think about it, it's not a day, it's not a week, it's not months, it was years. It was almost 5 years later. Anybody here do HR? Right? What's the problem? You got to pay the guy. He was off the payroll for almost 5 years. They spent another year and a half trying to hash it out, all because they didn't wait 24 hours. Now, guys, that's an extreme example of what can happen. But I want you to file it away when you're thinking, we don't need to worry about it, because I don't want you to get in that box where you've made an important decision and someone says they tried to keep the public out, files a complaint, and the commission agrees and wipes the whole thing out. You don't want to do it. No, just as an aside, we all make mistakes, right? In that situation or in others. Someone, raises a red flag and says, gee, they didn't notice the meeting properly, and they file an FOI complaint. Don't ever hesitate to say, you know what? Maybe we did make a mistake. We'll call Tom and check, or we'll check with our attorney or the town manager or the town clerk, and we made a mistake. Go back and do it again. Even if the person files the complaint and the complaint goes all the way forward, what's the ramification? None. If you fixed it already, the commission says, well, you were wrong, but you obviously knew better, so you fixed it, and it's over. But that town chose to be stubborn and not do anything about it and wound up paying a rather large price. I'm gonna sort of deviate from the script here for just a second, because we're talking about meetings, And as everybody knows, back in March of 2020, when the pandemic hit, we had to change the way we did business. All of what I'm telling you now is still in place, but this is what was in place before the pandemic hit, and now we've got some add-ons. 2020 March, the governor issued some executive orders which allowed us to meet virtually, which allowed us to meet, continue to do business, and not have to meet in person. Those orders expired about more than a year ago, and then the legislature stepped in and set up some parameters to allow us to continue to do that. When the legislature did that in July of 21, they put a clause onto the law that said all these expire April 30th. And then at the last moment, this session, they took the expiration date, if you will, off. So some of these provisions are still in place, which allow us to meet in person, virtually, or they call it hybrid, somewhat in combination. It's your choice. One of the first things that a lot of questions came up, it's your choice. You can do it, as you see fit. But if you're going to have a virtual component to a regular meeting or a special meeting, you want to make sure that you've noticed some of the new rules. One of them is that instead of the 24-hour notice for the agenda, you have that. You also have a 48-hour requirement to let people know that there's going to be a virtual meeting. The board members need to be alerted, and the public needs to be told that there will be a virtual component to this meeting. Then when you put the agenda in 24 hours in advance, the requirement, which isn't necessarily in place for an in-person meeting, although most people do it, it's got to be up on your website with the link for people to link in, whether it's Zoom or WebEx or Skype, whatever you're using, you have to have that available at least 24 hours in advance as well. If it is a regular meeting, and a regular meeting only, you also need to record it. If it's totally virtual, or if it's got a hybrid, with the hybrid, you record it, and the recording needs to be on your website in 7 days, and it needs to be up there for 45 days. Those are some of the requirements with electronic meetings. Interestingly, they didn't include that for special meetings. Don't ask me why, but if it's a regular meeting, only electronic equipment, then you have to follow some of those rules. The other little tidbits that they threw in, if I come to your town hall and I put in writing, I say, you know what, my computer's down, I don't have internet, and you're having a virtual meeting, you need to help me out. You do need to help them out. I haven't seen it requested. I haven't gotten questions on it happening. But technically, if someone does that, you'd have to find a spot for them in town hall or a library or school to watch the meeting if you are in the total virtual mode. Another thing that we talk about with meetings is that anybody can attend. And in that process, anybody attending includes the virtual process as well. And people chime in. Has Southington had any problems with the phrases Zoom bombing? Have you heard about that? Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you had that? It's something that happened a lot in the beginning in March of 2020. Not as much now, but just recently, for instance, Bristol had a situation with a P&Z meeting that was bombed with pornography. What's that? Your board event. Yeah. Not cool. Remember that although the law requires you to let anybody in, be it virtually or not, you have a right to get those people off the screen. Just because people have a right, they don't have a right to disrupt your meeting, either, for fun or, in a negative, really negative way. Some of them were people yelling racial epithets, people, insulting board members. The irony is that many of them were not people from your town. People were bored, locked in, and they were calling for the one in Bristol. Even this is only just a couple months ago. They traced one of the hackers to a teenager in Maryland. We got to get activities for these kids. So, but the point is, you have a right to shut those people down. So be it in person, that was always in play. You could toss them if they're really disruptive, but online, you could mute them. You can take them off. You have a right to control and run an orderly meeting and get your work done. Just for a little levity, I had it happen to me once since we started with this virtual stuff. And by the way, I'm thrilled to be here in person. When I do these workshops online, people turn their camera off and I'm talking to myself for an hour, So we're doing this workshop with a group. It was like a League of Women Voters group, but not it's something like that. People, interested citizens. And my oldest daughter is an international teacher, and she was stuck at home with us, not able to go to Panama, which was the country she was teaching in. So she's teaching her first graders in Panama in my dining room. And I'm pointing this way because she was downstairs and I was upstairs. So I'm talking to these folks, talking FOI, and all of a sudden my screen goes black. And I hear this loud kind of dance, reggae music kind of thing, And I'm thinking it's the first graders. And then she yells up the stairs and she said, "Dad, what's that music?" And I'm saying, uh-oh. And as soon as she says that, the strippers parade across the thing. So FOI and strippers, right? Let me tell you, they left very little to the imagination. But again, we didn't have to keep them on there. They were able to get them off. So yes, people have a right to attend virtually or otherwise. You got to get the link out there, but you have a right to control the meeting. And as part of that, remember that the Freedom of Information Act does not require a public agency to allow public speaking, public comment. Most of us do. I would encourage that. You want to hear from your constituents, but remember, how public speaking goes is up to you. Is up to the board. Is up to the town. If you have a policy. So let's suppose you've got a packed house. It's budget time, and the board's looking around and saying, if we let everybody speak to the length that they want to, we'll never get through the night. 3-minute limit. You have every right to do that. That's a topic that has been beaten to death over the last months, and you just don't want to hear it. Say, look, public comment, but you can't talk about X. Now, I can't speak to political fallout or policy or anything like that, but if you do that, you're not violating freedom of information. So just sort of file that away. You have a right to, again, run an orderly meeting and control the flow. So if this public speaking gets out of hand, you can cut it down. And the same applies to if it's a virtual meeting. So you have, again, the right to do that and keep control. We're talking about making sure you're open and accessible. As you know, there are ways that boards and commissions can exclude the public. One of them is called going into executive session. Have we all heard that? I suspect you're fairly familiar with that term. Remember, folks, that an executive session is still part of an open, noticed meeting. So even if you have an item that, a one item agenda, and the item is an executive session item, you still have to notice the meeting. You still need to convene in public, and you need to make a motion to go into executive session for one of the 5 reasons. You go in, you make a motion, seconded, you cite the reason for going into executive session. By the way, both on the agenda and in the motion, you go in, you have the discussion for as long as you need to, and if you're going to take any action, you must come out and vote in public. Every vote must be in public. Every vote must be recorded in the minutes. It must be very clear who voted for what or for whom. 5 reasons for executive session. A personnel matter. Remember that if you're, again, making up the agenda or making a motion, you cannot just say executive session personnel or personnel matters. The courts have been very strong on that. You need to give people more. Now, you don't necessarily have to name the individual. Executive session, discussion of the performance of a police officer, discussion of the performance of a teacher, discussion of the performance of a public works employee. Once you do that, you then need to notify the individual that he or she is going to be discussed in an executive session. The person has the right to come forward and say, no, wait a minute, I don't want that in an executive session. I want you to do that in public so that everybody can hear it. And if the person does that, you can't go into executive session. That's the individual's right to say, I want it done in a public forum. If the person waives that right, where some get confused is that person does not then have the right to demand to enter the executive session with you. A lot of people think, they're talking about me, I go in the room. That's not the case. If the board wants to invite the person in to hear his or her side of the story, or to invite someone in for his or her expertise, or to get information on something, the board can always do that. But once that is waived, if you will, the only people who have a right to be in the executive session are members of the board. You invite in whomever you want, you hear what they have to, they give evidence, they give testimony, and when they're done, they should leave before you start deliberating. Yes?
So if they waive their right, how do they do that?
Not necessarily. I mean, if you come to me and say you're going to talk about you in executive session, I could just come up to you and say, no, look, I want that in public. If you want it in writing, you can ask for it. There's nothing in the law that says they have to, but you want to make sure that it's, and by the way, a lot of times people say, how do we notify them? I sort of leave that in your hands. Again, it's not spelled out in the law, but you know the situation, and you don't want somebody to come up afterwards and say they never notified me if it was just verbally. So if you think you need it in writing, put it in writing. Yeah, sure. The second executive session, pending claims or pending litigation. You're involved in a lawsuit. There's an FOI complaint. You're looking for strategy and negotiations as it pertains to that. You could do that behind closed doors. You would also have the right to go into executive session to contemplate taking legal action. You are the ZBA, and you deny somebody the variance that he needs to put a shed in his backyard. And I know this wouldn't happen in Southington, but they put it in anyway. You want to make a stand and say, look, we denied that variance, and make them move it. Well, you want to talk about how you're going to do that behind closed doors so the person isn't tipped off. You could have that kind of a conversation behind closed doors. The third reason, a security matter. Executive session to talk about security. Now, I got to be honest with you, the events of the last 24 hours in Texas, Sandy Hook, things like that, this never used to come up all that much, but it's coming up more and more. Boards of education, in particular, going into executive session to talk about resource officers, bulletproof glass, things like that, none of us in this room ever had to worry about when we went to school, but it's a reality today. That would be legitimate. Another one that's come up more recently is cybersecurity. I don't know if any of you saw it. Plainfield, it's about a month or so ago now, everything got hacked. Their police, their fire, their town hall, they had no access because there was some sort of a virus that someone had put in there. So they had to have meetings to talk about how to make sure that didn't happen again and what they were going to do. So think, if you're going to have that meeting, why have it in public on the off chance that the person who did the hacking is sitting there listening to what you're trying to do to stop him or her the next time? So you could have that conversation behind closed doors. Number 4, executive session to talk about a land transaction. The town is going to lease a building. The town is going to buy some property to build a new firehouse. The town is going to, build a new school. So you're negotiating buying or selling a piece of property. You wouldn't have to do that in public, so that the town's hand isn't tipped as to what the pricing is from a town perspective. The last one, number 5, is a little bit broader than the others in that it allows a board or commission to have a conversation about a document or documents that it believes are exempt from disclosure. A good example of that is you project out to bid. The bids come in. You want to study them. A Board of Education puts its transportation contract out to bid. In come the bids, DATCO, First Student, Durham Services, they all come in. You want to look at them. Well, there's an exemption in the FOI Act that allows a board or commission to withhold the content of bids or RFPs until you've actually signed the contract. It's a temporal exemption, but when they come in, you're allowed to withhold them from everybody else. So you say, I'm making a motion to go into executive session to talk about the bid packages we receive for the transportation contract. You vote, you go in. And by the way, to vote to go into executive session, you need a 2/3 vote of those board members who are present and voting to go in. You go in, you look at the bids over, you come out and you say, I make a motion that we approve the DATCO contract. Boom, you do it. Now, once you do that, the bids go out, but you would have had the right to review them behind closed doors. Another easy example would be you need a written legal opinion from your attorney. You are, confused about an issue, you want to make sure, so you ask the attorney for a written legal opinion. Well, you're the client now. So the document's covered by the attorney-client privilege. It's not a document you're going to share with the rest of the world. you could have that conversation going over the attorney's written advice behind closed doors. Those are just a couple examples on that last one, because there's so many different records that might fall under that. Any questions about executive session before I move on? Yes.
There are disagreements with what the dollar amount is going to be for the budget.
Okay. If that is the case, well, we're going to get to caucus in a second. Okay. No. Okay. Those are the 5 reasons for an executive session. Now, the next piece of where boards and commissions are allowed to meet without the public, caucus is one of those things. And this is, by the way, one of those parts of the law where I wind up banging my head against the wall. The sentence that follows the definition of meeting that I read in the beginning goes like this: meeting does not include. And there follows a list of things which every one of us in this room would say, gee, that sounds a lot like a meeting. But the legislature said, you can call it a meeting if you want, but for the purposes of freedom of information, it's not a meeting. And since you brought it up, one of those things is the caucus. The caucus allows members of the same board and the same party to meet wherever, talk wherever, not noticed, not open, no minutes, and have a conversation about anything they like. Now you're saying, wait a minute, they wrote this law for open government. That sounds like a huge loophole. Yeah, but remember who wrote the law? Politically minded legislators wrote the law. So they created this loophole. So what party are you? Are we on the Board of Finance? Okay, what party? Okay, so if all the Democrats on the Board of Finance want to go and fight over budget items, they can do that as long as they don't invite anybody else into the room. So that's perfectly legit. It falls under those things that look like a meeting but aren't a meeting. It's a caucus. But if you invite anybody else in, the caucus provision is broken and somebody could file a complaint. Yes?
So even if your caucus meets the definition of quorum of the bigger board.
Yes. Yes. Hence my definition of it as a loophole. But yes, where people get into trouble by using the caucus is they invite other people in. The Board of Finance is caucusing about the Board of Ed budget. It invites in the superintendent and the Board of Ed chair. Boom, it's not a caucus anymore. So if you're going to caucus, be very, very careful. Other things that look like a meeting but aren't a meeting according to the law. Executive level search committees. You're on the police commission, the chief retires, you form a search committee to look for a new chief. It includes the whole board, yet the law says that you can do that outside of freedom of information. Collective bargaining. Any of you involved in that? As much fun as you've ever had in your life, right? You sit there for hours, back and forth, arguing over 0.25% for health benefits, things like that. Well, guess what? Not a meeting. So you're doing really hard work. The people really should know about it, but it's outside of freedom of information. The one that I always makes me chuckle. You're allowed to have a chance meeting or a social gathering, neither planned nor intended for the purpose of discussing matters relating to official business. The meeting's over. You want to go out for a drink. You want to go out for dinner. What else are you going to talk about? Come on. So look, I'm supposed to sit here and tell you, don't talk about anything related to business. Let's not be naive. Let's be realistic. But here's what you want to be really smart about, folks. Do not have those deep, deliberative conversations offline that you should be having here at the table. You want to be really smart that you're not, maybe you're reviewing what happened at the last meeting, or you're talking about setting up the agenda for the next time. But I guarantee you, the one time you go out to dinner or go out and you start venting and you get into that big debate, like, the big budget debate, they carry it over to the bar. I guarantee you the wrong person sitting in the next booth and files a complaint you've had an illegal meeting. Be really smart and really intelligent the extent to which you have those discussions outside of the meeting room. Do not set your budget over the eggnog at the Christmas party. Be really smart about that. And to carry that a little bit further, when I read the definition of a meeting, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, Electronic equipment was put in there for telephones, 47 years ago. Well, it's a lot more than phones, isn't it? It's emails, it's text, it's Twitter, Facebook, all of those things. I'm not telling you to stop using them, but again, the chairman sends out something. I want everybody to read this. And I want you to know that in paragraph 4, I feel really strongly about this, and I think we ought to do it. I'm going to bring it up at the next meeting. Okay, that's fine. Problem comes when one board member looks at that and says, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, and writes back. And then another member jumps in and says, no, I really like that idea. And then you start having the debate via email or text or something like that you should be having here at the table. Don't do it. There's double jeopardy there. First of all, you'll see in a minute that anytime you create a record like that, it becomes a public record as defined by the FOI Act. So if somebody could say, I want to see any and all emails between board members about topic X, you'd have to produce them. Now they know your thoughts. Now they also know, hey, wait a minute. There was a quorum of people talking about this issue. Isn't that a meeting? Yes. So you're vulnerable to the claim that you've had an improper meeting, and also some thoughts that maybe you didn't want to divulge, at least not yet, are out there publicly. So be really smart the extent to which you use those devices to communicate, and not have the deep deliberative conversations that you should be having here at the table. Yes, but only to the extent that listen, we've all been working at home a lot. I don't know about some, but my town, they can't give us all, town email addresses, and because it just would explode. So we're going to use our own devices. The only things that are subject to FOI are those things that you create in the conduct of Southington business. So that doesn't mean I'm going to grab your phone or your laptop and take everything. It means that you'd be required to extract those things that you've created as part of Southington business, and if somebody makes a request for them. So it doesn't matter what platform, what device you're using, but it becomes a public record. But the one that you send to your wife telling you you'll be home in an hour, or the one she sends to you asking you to pick up milk, that's not it's only those that are created in the conduct of public's business. If somebody wants to see it, yes. If they ask for any email between you and the council chair, you'd have to produce it. Now, it may fall under the one of the multiple exemptions that exist, but for starters, if it has to do with council business, it does become, by definition, a public record. You might be able to withhold it. No, personal, no. Right. Absolutely not. Right. The last thing with meetings is minutes. Do we have any people responsible for minutes in the room? A couple poor, unfortunate souls. I do the FOI Commission meeting minutes. I feel your pain. Here's my advice on minutes. They need not be the recreation of War and Peace. They are not meant to be verbatim transcripts. They are not every word that everybody says. And I guarantee you've all been at meetings where people have stood up and say, I'm going to read this to you, and I want every word of this in the minutes. It's not required. In fact, the only thing that's required in minutes is a record of who votes for what or for whom. That's the only requirement. Oh, I see some happy people. But you want more than that, obviously. You're creating Southington's historical record. I get that. But how much more you put in there, folks, is up to you. It's not meant to be a transcript. It's meant to be a crisp, clear, concise recapitulation of what happened. You make sure they're done within 7 days and submitted, and you move on to the next event. You don't want to make yourselves crazy over minutes. You want to make sure that they're concise, that they have all the facts in them, and then you move on. Before I give you a couple minutes about records, does anybody have any questions about things related to meetings that I didn't touch on that you want to ask about? Yes.
I just want to bounce off a question that he had mentioned. So if there was an email between me and the chair or whatever, and somebody put a request saying that I want all emails between these two parties, is that considered an officiating expedition? Or would they have to have some sort of focus on what their search was?
You would try to get them to have a focus, but they insist on all because they think that something nefarious is going on. The one that it's a personal item, you wouldn't have to, but anything that has to do with council business, you'd want to produce them and put them out.
Did that include text messages as well?
Yeah, now the answer is yes, but the reality is that those are a lot harder to capture, if you will. most of them, some of them disappear. And we find that the carriers, the Verizons of the world, are not all that eager to help retrieve them. But it would include a text message. We had a situation with a text message. A first selectman or mayor, and it was up in Putnam, had won the biggest pumpkin growing contest at the fair. And he had the picture and the text that he had sent to everybody, and he was showing it around. And he didn't get along all that well with his administrative assistant. He said, I'm in a good mood. Gives it to her anyway. And she scrolls down, and it was attached to text that basically called her, what's the right name? A slut. All right. And so she, rightfully so, goes crazy and wants to see it. And he goes through the whole thing. Well, I never, but it was there. And so he couldn't delete it. And so he ultimately came to us and we ordered its release. So if it's there, yes. Yes, sir.
Is there any prohibition using reference like the scary message? Is there any law that blocks that? If that's scary, like scary messages scare me. I know people will use that like Snapchat or WhatsApp that automatically self-destruct. I see the purposeful destruction of official communications. Blocks that.
You'll love this. I'm going to punt on that one because there are records retention laws in Connecticut which have nothing to do with FOI. So that question is best addressed to them. The public records administrator is housed in the state library, and they would be better equipped to answer that question. The answer is maybe from my perspective, but I don't know for sure. Yes, sir.
Can I go back to when you were talking about virtual versus in-person meetings?
Yep.
It's not so much anymore with back live, thank God. But if there were certain situations where a subcommittee meeting was going to be live, but the numbers rose and we called it virtual the day before, or maybe 2 days before. It could have been 2 days before because we went back. We were going back and forth.
Yep. Yep.
Live. So what's the ruling there? I mean, I know you said 48 hours for virtual meeting,
Right.
but I know for sure.
Was But what I would suggest is if you think there might be a problem, perhaps notice it as a hybrid meeting. And if it comes to the point where, you know what, we shouldn't be in person tonight, there's a provision that allows meetings to be moved for safety reasons. Now it's a little bit of a stretch, but this was written in 1975. So I would argue that you put a sign on the door that said the in-person portion of this meeting will not be held, the meeting will be totally virtual, and then I would argue that you were covered. We had a situation in Middletown, again, when the numbers were up. They had an in-person meeting, then they had an outbreak in town hall, but they had noticed it as a hybrid, so it was easy enough to say the in-person part is not going to happen. They put a sign on the door, and the meeting went forward. If it's within the 48 hours, I might think about waiting, but sometimes you can't. And by the way, we are not the FOI FBI. Somebody calls and complains about that. Unless they file a formal complaint, we're not jumping in. So you sort of weigh what's going on locally as well. Right. Yes, ma'am. Yep.
in this building. The night of the event, you find out you're going to have a larger crowd than this building could accommodate, and you can use the school.
Yep.
Can you move it
Yes. Yes.
with notice, like if you put notice up on the doors, or how do you?
If the room is too small, you put it, now, there's another place where I scratch my head over the words they used. They say you're adjourning the meeting. You're not really, you're moving it. You put a sign on the door that says this meeting has been moved to the high school because we didn't have enough room in here. Go ahead and do that. My suggestion is always to leave somebody at this location to sort of guide them there, and then maybe start the other meeting a little bit later to allow people to go from point A to point B. But it's absolutely allowable. If you wanted to look up, there's 3 different pieces of the statute, sections 228, 229, and 230, which kind of talk about this in different possibilities, different permutations, I guess I would say. So a little bit about public records. we couldn't do the whole public records things justice in 10 minutes, but I want to give you an overview. When you read the definition of a public record, just let some of the words sink in. Public records or files means any recorded data or information relating to the conduct of the public's business, prepared, owned, used, received, or retained by a public agency, or to which a public agency is entitled to receive a copy by law or contract, whether such data or information be handwritten, typed, tape recorded, videotaped, printed, photostated, photographed, or recorded by any other method. Part 2, except as otherwise provided by any federal law or state statute, all records maintained or kept on file by any public agency, whether or not such records are required by any law or by any rule or regulation, shall be public records. And every person shall have the right to inspect such records promptly during regular office or business hours, copy such records in accordance with subsection G of 1-212, or receive a copy of such records. So the short version is, what I was saying before, is that every record held by every public agency in the state of Connecticut is under the umbrella defined as a public record. Whether you've read it or used it or studied it or written it or received it from somebody, it becomes a public record. Now, if that were just sort of the flat out answer to the question, then why are we having the conversation? Because it's not. And you have to know that and sort of absorb that, but then understand that there are various exemptions and exceptions and different reasons you can hold different records back. We could spend hours going over them. If you'd like, I'll do all 28 of the exemptions and we can have a quiz afterwards, But that's you just need to know that those exemptions exist. You need to know that if you get a request for a record, okay, it's a public record. I'm going to gather it. It may or may not be exempt. But you want to look at what happens sometimes is people get very possessive. They're mine, you can't have them. They're council records, you can't have them. They're P&Z records, you can't have them. Or we get selective. You look like a nice guy, we're going to give them to you. But you look very suspicious. You get nothing, and you out. You've been nothing but trouble the whole time. You would think that after 47 years that didn't happen, but it happens all the time. Listen, I know you have a nice town. You probably don't have any difficult people to deal with. We all have them. We have people who have started to use this law as a weapon, as a means of getting back at people. We don't encourage that. We try to stop that. It makes us crazy because the purpose of this law is a good purpose. We have them too. We had one guy, and he's still tormenting us. Between 2011 and 2016, he filed more than 450 complaints against various agencies around the state. We reached the point where his complaints became so outrageous that we stopped scheduling them for hearings, which we never used to do. He challenged that in court. The courts found in our favor. He kept coming back for more. We helped the legislature create a provision, if you have anybody who's really bad, if you look at section 1-206, that allows a public agency to deal with a vexatious requester. You can come to the FOI commission and ask for relief. His town, this guy's town, he's the gold standard, came to us and we found in the town's favor and banned him from making requests to East Lyme for 1 year. Okay? That's how bad he was. So we get it. We know what's out there. But you still, even when he comes into our office and asks for a record, we forget that it's him and look at the record. My point is you've got to look at the content. It may be exempt for one reason or another. Then he doesn't get it. But if it's not, here you go. When you get a request for records, now I don't know how you're structured, if a council member gets a record or a Board of Ed member gets a record request. Always make sure that there's a response in 4 business days. Respond doesn't necessarily mean produce the records, but you need to acknowledge it, because if you don't, the law says that you've denied access and the person can file a complaint that you've denied them access to a record. So at the very least, make sure that there's a response in 4 business days. Okay, then Tom, how long do we have? Well, the law doesn't specify. The law says that you must provide access to all records that are not exempt in prompt fashion. Anybody want to take a crack at that? What does that mean? Nobody knew what it meant. It went to court very early in the life of this law, and the court said, we've got your back on this. Prompt means without undue delay. Okay, now I don't know about you, I'd like a deadline. I'd like somebody to tell me you've got a day, a week, a month. We don't have that. But the flip side of not having a deadline is that only you know where the records are. Only you know how that particular department is staffed on a given day, and that maybe somebody's out on maternity leave or out on vacation, and it's going to take a little longer. A request for records under Freedom of Information does not mean that things get brought to a screeching, grinding halt. It's important. It's critical. I mean, key things have happened in this state over the last 47 years because of freedom of information, people getting access to records. But it's not at the expense of everything else you have to do. The law says that you provide records in prompt fashion if they're not exempt, but you don't stop everything else that you're doing. You make sure that you get that work done as well. So you look at a request for records and you say, you know what? We could do this maybe 2 hours a week. And at 2 hours a week, it's going to take us 5 weeks to produce the records. And if that's an honest assessment of what you think it's going to take, and you think 5 weeks is reasonable without undue delay, then you go to the requester and say, it's going to take 5 weeks. Now, if the record's sitting right there, it's an agenda that you've just printed up, it's not even 4 days, it's 20 seconds. You give them the record. I'm not telling you you have 5 weeks but if you think that 5 weeks is reasonable, and that's your response, and the person wants to challenge it anyway, and you're comfortable with that, and you can prove that 5 weeks is a reasonable amount of time, then that's what you should do. So you want to set it up based on what you think makes the most sense. Again, we could talk forever about the different kinds of records. Remember, first of all, that it's all records. We've sort of answered the question, the emails, the texts, it's everything. One of the exemptions that comes up a lot, just to give you an example, is an exemption for records that are in a personnel, medical, or similar file. Comes up a lot. The law says that you can withhold something that's in one of those files if you believe that it's an invasion of the employee's privacy. The standard for that was set in 1993, a state Supreme Court case called the Perkins decision. The Perkins case was about a teacher who objected to the release of her attendance records. Supreme Court said, and went to the Supreme Court, says, you know what? Attendance records of all of us who work in the public sector are public, period, end of story, give them out. And then it said to an invasion of this woman's privacy, the release of the records would have to have been both highly offensive and not a matter of public concern. It would have to have met both prongs of the test. So if you get a request for a personnel file, those of you who would deal with them, or you're even on the fringe of dealing with it, you're supposed to look at it and say, is it highly offensive and not a matter of public concern to release the record? If you think it is, you then go to the employee or the public officer and say, we think it's an invasion of your privacy. If that person says, I don't care, then out it goes. But if the person says, yeah, you're right, that's an invasion of my privacy, then the record does not get released until or unless the requester files a complaint with the FOI Commission, and the commission says, sorry, Southington, you were wrong, give the record out. The problem is sort of figuring that out. What's highly offensive and not a matter of public concern? It's so much a matter of interpretation, a matter of judgment. One story to show you an example. Middletown, a few years ago, there was a situation where an officer was having all kinds of trouble at home. It was rumored. The rumors got really loud, so Middletown takes him off the street and puts him on desk duty. They then conduct an internal affairs investigation. The IA report comes back, and it does detail significant troubles for the guy at home. But it also says, you know what, he's doing a fine job as a police officer. They put him back on the street. The Hartford Courant makes an immediate request for the IA report. Remember, everything's a public record, even an IA report. So they ask for it. Middletown PD looks at the sort of details of trouble at home and say, you know what, it would be highly offensive to tell everybody about this guy's problems at home. And then it said, and it's not a matter of public concern because he's doing a good job as an officer. We think it meets both prongs. The guy agreed. They didn't give it out. So the Courant, as is its right, files a complaint with the FOI Commission. The commission looks at the records and says, highly offensive to tell everybody about this guy's problems at home. And the public doesn't need to know it because he's doing a good job. It meets both prongs, complaint dismissed. Report was never released. The problem with the invasion of privacy standard is that most of what's being sought is highly offensive stuff. If you think about it, people are looking for personnel records. Someone's been suspended or fired or fined or dead. So they've done something that's probably highly offensive, But that second prong of not being a matter of public concern isn't met, because if a police officer is fired, the public's been paying his or her salary, they would have a right to know. So even though the material is highly offensive, you've got to really make sure that it's not something the public has a right to know. And the different exemption, and we mentioned the bids, we mentioned records that attorney-client privilege, records that might have trade secrets in them. A lot of people marching with town hall, like in planning and zoning or something like that, say, here are the plans, but there's trade secrets in here, don't give them out. If you're ever in a position like that, make sure that the person delivering the records understands that once they cross the threshold and you give them to the public agency, they fall under that umbrella, and it's your decision whether or not they're released, not theirs. A lot of attorneys will send to public agencies and just automatically stamp it confidential, and it might not be. So just understand that if somebody wants to see records, you want to think hard about whether the exemption fits or not. And, they're here. You can call us. One of the wrinkles with records compliance is that there are state statutes and federal laws that say these are records you can't release. If I say nollie, are any of you familiar with that, the law enforcement term? If you're arrested and the case is nollied after 13 months, the records are erased. Well, law enforcement agencies are constantly being asked for records that have been erased by the nollie statute. There's a state statute that overrides FOI. You don't give them out. The problem is there's no list of any of those. There's no list of exceptions and exclusions. So you got to know what statutes cover the records you deal with on a regular basis. Again, I've promised to keep it to about an hour. We're just about there. Does anybody have any questions about records or? Yes. Right. That's entirely your decision. If you believe it's and many times people just do that to avoid the fees. So unless you truly believe it's in the public's best interest, you're not required to waive the fees. By the way, the fee is 50 cents a page for a paper document. There is no fee for electronic records because the legislature hasn't gotten there yet. I suspect someday there will be, but right now there is none. If you, as a council member, want records pertaining to your work as a councilman, yes, it's waived. Yeah. So let me leave you with one other little story to sort of drive home the idea that everything is a public record. And I can't stress that enough. I want you to be really smart about the extent to which you create records. One of the major cities in the state, this is during the height of the pandemic, so, we were all working from home. So they're looking for a senior legal secretary, and the interviews are being conducted Zoom and WebEx and God knows how else on the phone, emails. They're not seeing each other. It's not like they're in a room. So they reach a point where the head of the law department of this city writes the following email to a colleague. I would like you soon to reach out to, woman's name is redacted, on behalf of the law department to thank her for her interest in the position and to inform her that we went in another direction. I feel that you have the most experience in our office handling these types of discussions. Tom pauses for effect. After many years of breaking off relationships with your past girlfriends and flings. Are you kidding me? The email is entitled, Let Her Down Easy, Playboy. Guys, you can't make it up. What was he thinking? He was probably thinking that nobody else was going to see it. Well, then, Tom, why did you see it? Because he sent this email to his colleague when the colleague was conducting a virtual deposition in an open courtroom, and boom, it pops onto the screen in the middle of the deposition. I kid you not. You want to think before you write. Clearly think before you send. Now, we all get stuff like that, and we've all made mistakes. I was, the board I was chair of was the Board of Education, and I had one member who could not stop sending me board-related emails at work. She's sending confidential Board of Education stuff to the Freedom of Information Commission. So you get my point. Just be really smart. Understand that you're creating public records. Yes, they might be exempt, but think before you start spreading them around. Is there anything that I haven't touched on that you want to ask about? Anything at all? Now, what's going to happen is I'll leave and you'll say, oh, I should have asked. I literally spend most of the time on the phone answering questions. please call if you have them. If you get voicemail, which is likely because I'm on the phone, I will call you back. I have people who will attest to that. And don't be bashful. Don't say, that sounds stupid, because this law can be very, very difficult. So call it anytime. Yes, sir.
I just want to confirm, voting
It's not a good idea. No. You want to make sure that you're at a meeting when you're voting. I brought with me, where are they? Some of these, and I'll leave a packet of them. I call this the Connecticut Freedom of Information American Express card. Don't leave home without it. They're little highlight cards, very small print, but we're a small agency. They're great for a wallet, a purse, a desk drawer. Our phone number's on the back, the email address is on the back. So help yourselves, take one, and if there are no other questions, well, there is one. Go ahead. Texting? Don't do it, because that could be a meeting. Don't do it. That could be a meeting within a meeting. We had a board member in Watertown get zapped for that. If I'm chairing, and by the way, that same woman who sent me those emails, I could never get her to put her damn phone down in the middle of the meeting. She claimed she was just checking up on her kids and their homework. First of all, the optics of it are really bad, folks. It looks horrible. But second of all, someone can ask to see those emails, and if they have any link, any thread of a link to board members, to board business, you've got a problem, because you're conducting board business secretly. So that's a great question. Don't do it. Yes.
One board of commission is having a meeting and someone on another board of commission is out in the audience and texting the people up there.
They're public records. That's why you just want to put the phone down. You just want to put it down. We're all tethered to our phones. Let's be honest. But you just don't want to have them out in the middle of a meeting like that. You just don't.
On behalf of our town, the folks that are here, the folks that will be listening to you for many, many, many years to come, because we have it all on tape.
Great.
I want to just thank you.
You are welcome.
Extremely informative and very
Happy to do it. Have a good night, folks. Okay. Yes.
I'm sure you take it. I like it. I think I have one of these, actually.
Thank you very much. You are welcome. Good to see you. All right. Call early and often. I do have a couple of guys. There you go. All right, sure.
Thank you for all set.